I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves, discovering that it was an intelligence-enhancing, consciousness-raising experience.
And so, I mean, for me, when I first began learning about this subject and I learned about the CIA, I had very little interest in it. I wasn't interested in hearing about what the CIA had done, these terrible experiments that they performed on unwitting subjects. We've seen that popularized. It just didn't interest me. It wasn't until I was going through Gordon Wasson's archives. Okay. So Wasson, should I back up and say a little more who Wasson is? I mean, I don't know who our listeners are and
Sure, please. I'm very familiar because I've been following your work for a while now with Gnostic Media and Joe Atwill and Steve Altram and others. But for those who haven't followed that line, and I will be plugging that information in as a resource library, but please, by all means.
Okay, so Wasson, this is how I got started. I was taking a course at, I was a student at Columbia University in New York, and I was interested in the history of religion. And first day of class, our professor was talking about the Vedas, which is the oldest body of writings in Indian religions. And the oldest of the Vedas were called the Rig Veda. And it was about a ceremony where these ancient people, 5,000 years ago, I think it was, were go out and hunt for soma. And soma was, nobody really knew for hundreds, thousands of years, what was soma. It was a plant, it was a spirit, it was a god, it was, scholars have debated what soma was for a very long time. And our professor wrote on the board, he said, and recently, in the late 1960s, a man named R. Gordon Wasson, it's the first time I'd heard that name, who was, ironically, perhaps, a Wall Street banker, is how he was described, who was studied mushrooms as a hobby. And he and his wife conducted this extensive research over decades and finally came to an argument that soma was a certain species of mushroom. They said the Amanita muscaria mushroom. And I just thought that was so fascinating that here's a guy who was a Wall Street banker who was interested in hallucinogenic mushrooms and then wrote an important book solving a riddle that had baffled historians for forever. And I remember him writing the name Wasson on the board, and I just thought, wow, that is so interesting, huh? All these years, I thought that these mushrooms were just these things that fucked people up, and now here's this significance to them. I'm gonna look into this. And so I dove in, and little did I know that it would be, so that was 1978. It would just be 3 or 4, let's see, 1984, I had, by then graduated from college and had started graduate school. And then I took a year off from graduate school and I was spending a little time in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I decided that I would organize a conference at Harvard in the Divinity School on psychedelics and the history of religion. And so I got support from the Harvard faculty. And Richard Schultes, who's a very famous ethnobotanist, said to me, one of the world's leading experts on the botany of psychedelic plants, said, why don't you invite Gordon Wasson? And I thought, wow, why, I didn't even think of that. He was like such a famous, I was so shy, like, really? Whoa. And he had a dial phone and he dialed Wasson's number and he slid the phone across the desk to me. Next thing I know, I'm on the phone with this guy, Wasson. And the next thing I know, I borrowed my father's fancy Lincoln Continental and got a haircut maybe, and put on a sports jacket and drove to Danbury, Connecticut to meet the great man. And we hit it off because I was kind of scholarly. I was down on Leary at the time. I was really interested in the history of the mushrooms from a scholarly, revolutionary way. And Wasson greeted me, and I drove him up to Cambridge, and we had this conference, and I drove him back, and we began to write letters. And then, in fact, one thing you'll put on for the viewers is I conducted a fairly extensive interview with him that's published in my first book. He only gave 2 or 3 interviews in his whole life, and one of them was to me. And we covered his whole career, and I thought I was special. And then several years after that, I decided to bring some of his books back into print. They were classic and important texts on the history of psychedelics and generating some of the world's most important religious traditions. And he did a book called The Wondrous Mushroom. He did a book, The Road to Eleusis. He did a book called Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality. And he was a very elitist sort of guy. And he first printed his books only in these very expensive, limited editions, and then paperbacks. And then they went out of print, and they were like, they would, if you could find one, they would cost hundreds. Like here, look, here's one I'm using. I lost almost my entire library in a fire, but I was able to save some things. Like this is a typical example of Wasson, how Wasson published his books, right? Like gold leaf, these fancy editions that are printed at a very famous printer in Italy, the Stamperia of Valdenega, and he gave me all the copies. He had a few of these, and he gave them to me. I mean, this book this is worth hundreds of dollars on the antiquarian book market. So anyway, I decided that I was going to bring them back into print and get scholars of religion and history and anthropology to re-examine this subject that was lost in all of the hysteria of the 60s. And he had died by this time, but I knew his daughter, and she was the executor of the estate, and they gave me permission. And the next thing I know, I was granted access to his archives, which had been bequeathed to Harvard University. There's a whole section there, the Gordon and Tina Wasson Ethnomycological Library. You needed special permission to get in there, and the Wassons said that I was working with them, and I was like, Harvard gave me an office in the herbaria. I had a secretary, and she would go, and I had this whole menu of all the things that were in the archives. And I went through, I still have a lot of them scanned into my computer, but I was mostly interested, of course, in the mushroom stuff. But I noticed that there were some files that were just correspondence or banking stuff. And I thought, what the hell? And I asked her for some of these. And then suddenly this was like that day at Columbia, a light went off in my head, like, oh my God, this is huge. Because we all knew that Wasson was a Wall Street banker, but that's not really very accurate or descriptive, because he wasn't really a banker in terms of banking stuff. Like, he didn't deal with money that much. He dealt with, he was into public relations. He worked for JP Morgan, and JP Morgan, sure, that's a bank, but JP Morgan is really more like a political force, and not one that's really friendly to democracy. I mean, JP Morgan was a supporter of the Third Reich. And I just started to think about this stuff. And then I'm looking at Wasson's letters and who he's writing to and the tone of these letters. So he wasn't just a banker. He was a guy that was in the very innermost circle of what I call the American fascist movement. I mean, he's pals with people like Allen Dulles. Now, people should know who Alan Dulles was. Alan Dulles was one of the the first or the second, I think he was the first director of the CIA. Alan Dulles was the main guy behind the assassination of John Kennedy. Alan Dulles was the guy who started MK Ultra. Alan Dulles, before he was in this position as the head of the CIA, he was a banker who invested money of the Third Reich. He was Hitler's banker, basically, right? And then this is where the subject starts getting really scary and offensive to a lot of people who are not that hip to American history. But that whole post World War II and post World War II history has to be revised. So, like your excellent conversations with Joseph Atwill, who's a man I respect immensely and is a very good friend of mine, that's really important stuff to get out, because we have been, anybody that's been educated in the United States in a conventional, education has been tricked. And I had more than a conventional education. I mean, I went to 2 Ivy League schools and University of Chicago, and I've taught at the University of California, and people don't have a clue about this stuff. So anyway, there I am in Cambridge in Wasson's archives, and I realized, my God, this guy is like working with these people, and that just was shocking to me. Like, used to be just think it was ironic that the psychedelic movement, this hippie anti-war thing, was kind of started by a guy who was a Wall Street banker, but he wasn't just a Wall Street banker; he was a fascist. I mean, his friends were. I don't really know. Wasson was very cagey about his own political positions. I didn't find anything but his associates and how his associates deferred to him. Guys like Alan Dulles, and George Kennan was another one. And I began to realize, there's something else going on here. And so I began to dig deeper and began to realize things that were shocking and disturbing and important, and put me into a kind of depressed place for a few years, like, oh my God. But eventually I kind of pieced it together that every single person who was leading the way, introducing these substances, were connected to intelligence, CIA, or it was a social engineering operation. And then I had kind of advanced that myself. And so it became kind of a duty of mine to tell the whole story.